I want you to imagine a scenario with me. Imagine that you're Vladimir Putin, and you're walking through the streets of Moscow with an attaché of Kremlin officials. And as you're walking, your group rounds a corner, and you see a group of Russian soldiers emerge. These are veterans who have returned home from the war in Ukraine, and it's a rather motley crew. Now, some of these men are in perfectly good health. Nothing has happened to them, no injuries, nothing like that, at least not on the outside. Others of these men, not so lucky. There are large portions of the men who are missing arms, others are missing legs, others are missing eyes, and among the group there are all sorts of other kinds of disfigurements, as a result of the war in Ukraine where these soldiers went and fought for Putin. And so imagine you're Vladimir Putin, and you're around the corner and you see these men, and they notice you. And they sort of all signal to each other, and they kind of get up together, and they start walking towards you. If you're Vladimir Putin, what is your reaction? Is your first thought, these are soldiers of Russia, and I am the president of Russia, and they are so excited to see me because of their profound patriotism that they want to come up to me and they want to greet me? Or rather, is your first thought, these are soldiers of Russia. They lost limbs fighting for me in a war that they now know was based on lies. And they were mistreated by their commanders, and many of them lost limbs or other parts of their body. They lost friends, maybe family members, and now they're all walking towards me. Oh no, here they come to finally get their vengeance. Now, this is a hypothetical scenario for many reasons. First of all, likely because of his fear of this exact scenario, Vladimir Putin doesn't just go walking around Moscow in full exposure to the Russian people. And when he does, it typically seems to be at winter time when it's cold out and there's not as many people on the streets. And it's also a hypothetical scenario because it's actually quite rare for Russian soldiers with extreme disabilities to actually return from the war, since many Russian soldiers who get these extreme disabilities, rather than being given the proper care, are instead just put back on the front line, so that Russia can avoid their dissatisfaction and also avoid having to pay for their care. But despite the fact that this is a hypothetical scenario, the question that it poses is rather interesting. How would Vladimir Putin respond if he came across a group of soldiers like this? And the fact that we actually have to ask that question, and that the answer is not immediately obvious that the soldiers would be excited to see their president, is quite telling. I'm quite confident, for example, that if we were to ask this question about a different leader approaching a different group of soldiers, the answer would be quite obvious, and it would be that this group of soldiers was rising to greet their president in a patriotic fashion. If we were talking, for example, about Roosevelt or Churchill after World War II, and they were approaching a group of their soldiers from their respective countries, these soldiers would rise to greet the president. Most of these soldiers would be rising to salute the president at the very least, doing whatever they could to acknowledge him and to share their gratitude to him for being the leader of their country, even if they had suffered personal loss in that war that they were a part of. And I'm also quite confident that this would be true even of veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan here in the United States. Even though there was deep dissatisfaction about both of those wars, if those veterans were to meet President Bush, they would feel a sense of patriotism towards him. And so the fact that when it comes to Vladimir Putin, we even have to ask this question, and we even have to entertain the idea that these soldiers might be willing to exact vengeance on him, is quite telling. And if you're not sure which of these scenarios is more likely to play out in Putin's case, whether they're likely to be patriotic towards him or try to exact vengeance on him, you can find out extremely quickly, just by watching videos of Russian soldiers on the front line who share their actual experiences and their actual thoughts. These videos I'm referencing are actually extremely numerous, which is quite a shocking fact in and of itself, considering that Russian soldiers aren't actually allowed to have cameras at the front line, and they aren't actually allowed to have cell phones at the front line to record and share their experiences, for a number of reasons, strategic and tactical, but also because Russia does not want the average Russian person, or the rest of the world for that matter, to know what life is really like for the average Russian soldier. And yet, despite this fact, many Russian soldiers have, at great risk to themselves and their lives and possibly their families, decided to record and share their experiences. And so many videos that you yourself can find online, with a lot of underlying themes. Some of the underlying themes will be that my commander has tried to abandon me, and my commander has basically made my life forfeit. And that if I want to survive, I actually have to pay a bribe to my commander out of my military salary so that he doesn't send me to the front line. And sometimes even if I pay the bribe, he'll send me anyways because he doesn't want there to be evidence that he actually did this. Others will say that they fell out of favor with their commander and they were sent to the front line and they were afraid of going back because they were afraid that their own soldiers would eliminate them. And they were actually more afraid of their own soldiers behind them than they were of the Ukrainians. This is not even referencing, of course, the other various instances of more basic things. Lack of water, filtered water in the middle of a summer. Lack of food, lack of ammunition, and all sorts of other situations. And then there's the soldiers who will go on video and who will tell of their stories where they were recruited for a large amount of money to join the Russian military, which they did of their own volition because they were told that they would be placed in a safe area far from the front line, when instead they found themselves without adequate training actually on the front line at great risk to themselves and to their lives. Other soldiers will tell of comrades who have been injured, who have not only been left on the battlefield, but who have actually been sent back to the battlefield despite their injuries, even with very critical injuries in areas like the legs that make it almost impossible to survive. Doing exactly what I referenced earlier, making it difficult for soldiers with extreme injuries to actually make it back and exist in Russian society. And all of these issues tell you exactly what must be going through Vladimir Putin's mind when he thinks about what is going to happen to him and to his country after this war ends, where all the soldiers who are currently deployed in Ukraine are sent home, and he now has a legitimate possibility on a regular basis of coming across soldiers who have had experiences like these, who now have nothing to lose, who have lost everything they have to lose, who have now been trained, if not by the Russian military, at least by their experience on the battlefield, who are now hardened just by the sheer difficulty of their experience of living without adequate food and water under combat pressures, who see him and who know that he and their commanders are to blame, and who might have a desire to exact vengeance for those facts. What's even more chilling for Vladimir Putin is that when he faces this scenario, he cannot rely on the patriotism of these soldiers being a factor in them having mercy on him. Because Vladimir Putin has never relied on the patriotism of the Russian people to create soldiers in the first place. Instead, Vladimir Putin's tactics to fill his military has been largely, how much can I pay you to bribe you to go to the battlefield? Which of course entices a certain kind of person who wants a better future. The kind of person who is doing everything they can to get the future that they've always dreamed of, who sees the paycheck they're going to get from the Russian military as the path to that. Men who serve hoping for that vision of the future, not serving out of patriotism. These types of men, when they come back from the war and they realize that all of this was empty promises, and they realize that they're not going to get the future they wanted, and it's actually Putin's fault, not only are they not patriotic, but for that reason too, they might be vengeful. Now, I could go on and on and on and on, but by now you get the picture. The point is that Vladimir Putin is actually in a scenario that not enough people are talking about, which is almost certainly having a profound impact on his psychology. A scenario where Vladimir Putin legitimately does not know what would happen to him if the war in Ukraine ended and all of these soldiers were to come back, especially if they were to come back together at the same time, and especially if they were to come back in defeat. Vladimir Putin, as he personally weighs the cost of all of this, must at least feel the strain of the risk, even if he doesn't think that something terrible happening to him is the most likely outcome. He absolutely knows that it is a high potential outcome. And that's especially true because he is a paranoid dictator. And in the past, he has talked about, with disdain, people who overthrow their leaders, indicating that for him, it's one of his greatest fears. And with all of these things being true, I don't think enough people are giving enough credit to how much this is impacting his thinking and the reasoning behind why he is still conducting the war against Ukraine and the way in which he's conducting it. And if Western leaders cannot understand these critical facts, and even if they don't agree with them, if they can't even consider them, the war in Ukraine could go in a very different direction than a lot of people think. With all of these things being true, or at least if you will concede that they are a highly plausible scenario, I don't think enough people are giving enough credit or enough thought to Vladimir Putin's psychology right now, and how that impacts how the war in Ukraine will continue, how the war in Ukraine will be fought, what kind of tactics will be used, and what an endgame scenario for the war in Ukraine might actually look like. A lot of Western leaders seem to be approaching the war in Ukraine as if Vladimir Putin were a rational leader. And one of my biggest fears is that they might be right, but that his rationality is not focused on the country of Russia, but instead his rationality is focused on himself and what is best personally for him. And as a leader of Russia, Vladimir Putin might calculate that what is best for him is to keep Russia's war against Ukraine going, even if that war is not best for Russia as a country. The implications of this are quite concerning. What they mean is that Vladimir Putin, as he becomes more and more paranoid about what might happen to him in his own country after the war ends, might actually be willing to resort to more and more despotic type of tactics. He might be willing to use soldiers with more violence and more abandon and less care for their lives because he's already used those tactics and he's kind of already committed to it. And so he actually might want to have as many Russian soldiers as possible be eliminated so that they don't actually come back to haunt him. He might throw these waves of soldiers at Ukraine in large meat wave style attacks, large offensives. Yes, as a gamble, because he kind of wants to still try to win the war in Ukraine if he can, but also because if he can't do that, the next best outcome for him is to, as much as possible, lower the number of people who are currently in the Russian military and replace them with new recruits who haven't had these same experiences and who might still be kind of looking at him through rose-colored glasses. That is a major implication. Another implication of this is likewise disturbing, where if Vladimir Putin actually fears the return of his own soldiers more than he fears a continuation of the war, he might actually do things on purpose to provoke a continuation of the war, which is, of course, exactly what we're seeing. But the caveat being he might do this even if he knows he can't win the war, which means, again, the war could last a lot longer than a lot of people hope. For example, when we see Vladimir Putin approaching the negotiation table lately, saying that he will agree to ceasefires, we consistently see him on the very next day launching consecutively, the largest air attacks on Ukraine that he has launched up to this point, and he keeps launching a new largest air attack against Ukraine all the time. And these are frequently targeted not at military infrastructure, they're targeted at civilian infrastructure. The kind of attacks that really are not going to do Russia any strategic or tactical benefit as far as helping them win the war faster. The idea, I guess, could be we're going to break the will and the spirit of the Ukrainian people so that they no longer want to fight, but he's been doing it long enough to know that the outcome is exactly the opposite. The more that he bombs Ukrainians' homes, the more they're determined to win at any cost and to keep fighting at any cost. And one thing a lot of people don't seem to be thinking about is Vladimir Putin might be doing that on purpose to provoke the Ukrainians into wanting to continue their war with him, because for him, that's what he needs as well. And of course, I'm not saying that for the Ukrainians to do that is the wrong outcome. I am saying that because Vladimir Putin is using these tactics and he wants to commit to the war, there's probably not a peace on the horizon anytime soon unless Russia is actually defeated. Now, if all of this sounds a little bit crazy to you, what everybody needs to remember is that Vladimir Putin has already demonstrated that he is not a person who thinks like you or a person who thinks like me. Instead, he is a person who already has been willing to invade his neighbor, who already has been willing to level cities, who already has been willing to use his own people with reckless abandon to waste their lives in order to achieve his objectives. He has already experienced 1 million casualties among his own people, and he doesn't seem in the slightest bothered by that. So the idea that he would commit to doubling down to the war effort just to preserve himself and his own goals, or even just to buy himself a little bit more time, well, it might not map to the psychology that you or I experience. It is actually, unfortunately, the most logical and rational thing for a person who has already taken the actions like Vladimir Putin has. With that in mind, I want to know what you guys who are watching this video think about this, because there are probably going to be hundreds of thousands of people who see this video, and hundreds of thousands of brains are obviously going to be better than one. What do you think about Vladimir Putin's psychology? And above everything else, what Western leaders at least need to consider is that Vladimir Putin might see it as just as threatening to end his war as he does to continue it. And that really needs to be accounted for in how the world approaches this situation. A quick thank you to all the patrons and everybody who buys coffees from me on this channel, who helps contribute to this work so that I can continue making videos like these. You guys are the ones who make this work possible, and I am super grateful. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you on the next one.